Good morning, friends, and welcome to our quarterly SGI educational webinar. This month, or this occasion, we're taking on and sharing about the theme of amplifying the voices of Indigenous peoples. Here in Milwaukee, we acknowledge that we are on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homelands along the southwest shores of Michigamme, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnic rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. As an organization, our very name, Seventh Generation Interfaith, is an homage to the great law of the Iroquois. The planet faces an existential crisis, and Indigenous people have been talking about it, planning for it, fighting against it, and organizing around it since the beginnings of colonial settlement around the world. Most non-Indigenous people don't have this long-term perspective, nor the many centuries of old knowledge of natural cycles and what to do to manage these and modify human practices where needed to get back into balance with the natural world. So today we're going to be hearing from some colleagues who work in this space with us. Frank, if you can move to the next slide. Participants will be in listen-only mode until the question and answer section, but you can enter your questions in the chat, and the webinar will be recorded and posted on our website as usual. For our reflection, taking the opening portion of Leslie Marvin Silko's novel Ceremony from 1977, she writes, "I will tell you something about stories," he said. "They aren't just entertainment. Don't be fooled. They are all we have, you see. All we have to fight off illness and death. You don't have anything if you don't have stories. Their evil is mighty, but it can't stand up to our stories. So they tried to destroy the stories, let the stories be confused or forgotten. They would like that. They would be happy, because we would be defenseless then." He rubbed his belly. "I keep them here," he said. "Here, put your hand on it. See, it is moving. There is life here for the people." That passage from Silko's novel emphasized the important role that storytelling plays within the Pueblo culture. It also summarizes the repeated attempts of white groups to decimate the Pueblo culture by destroying its ceremonies. The old stories, including Hebrew and Christian scriptures, have survived every attempt to dismiss, banish, deconstruct, or enshrine them. And they continue to demonstrate the power to comfort the afflicted, to afflict the comfortable, and to fire the imaginations of people around the world. Why? Perhaps it's because sacred narratives are as indigenous to human societies as language itself. They help order, interpret, and change the world. So we see today's webinar as a step in a conversation or a connection to a much bigger story. The best way to acknowledge the place where we live and work is to know and appreciate it. We encourage our SGI members to trace and celebrate their own connections to land and water, and get to know the local Indigenous history of sustainable, resilient human presence in this and other places. We should know the nearby Native nations and encourage work toward reconciliation where land has been taken and cultures erased. So let us turn to see our companions in today's webinar. We have with us Kate Finn of First Peoples Worldwide, Keith Doxtator of the Oneida Nation, and Steven Heim of Boston Common Asset Management. And our itinerary today will take us first through history and invisibility, Native mascots engagement, the DOPL engagement, and we'll look at FPIC, free prior informed consent and actions, and time for questions and answers. So let's turn first to Kate Finn. Kate is the Executive Director of First Peoples Worldwide, an organization whose mission is to work from a foundation of Indigenous values to achieve a sustainable future for all. Kate leads the organization, situated within the University of Colorado at Boulder, to build corporate accountability to the rights of Indigenous peoples at the intersection of law, finance, and business. Kate earned a JD and a Master's in Public Administration from the University of Colorado and a BA from Princeton University. She is an enrolled citizen of the Osage Nation, and Kate will speak with us about history and invisibility. Please, Kate.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here and for the kind introduction. As you noted, First Peoples Worldwide works from a foundation of Indigenous values to achieve a sustainable future for all. I'll just mention in reference to the reflection this morning that I am so proud to be an Osage woman and to bring that story into my work as a staff attorney and an attorney in federal Indian law. But I'd also like to call out in gratitude the ways that Steven Heim and Keith Doxtator have brought me into the wider movement of shareholder advocacy for Indigenous peoples, and the way that their stories and their mentorship and guidance have been so influential as part of my own journey here. So thank you so much for opening us in a good way. I'll go to the next slide. So we're here today to talk about Indigenous peoples, and I just wanted to frame for everyone the incredible breadth and wealth that Indigenous peoples around the world bring. There's an estimated 476 million Indigenous peoples worldwide. The number is growing. The number is growing because Indigenous peoples feel able to speak and able to be recognized. And the power of colonialism to push down identity has receded in some parts of the world. So we're lucky to see those numbers grow. Indigenous peoples belong to more than 5,000 different entities. Those are tribal governments, First Nation governments, formally recognized governments, traditionally recognized leadership structures all over the world. There's more than 5,000 different communities. We speak more than 4,000 different languages. And again, I'm so pleased to tell you this morning that that number is growing, especially in the United States, where language loss has been recognized as an issue for years and years and years. We are seeing more and more children who are able to speak fluently in their Indigenous language. So it's a really good time to be Indigenous. It's nice to see the ways that the cultural quilt is growing in color and being able to be amplified. Next slide, please. With that, I would like to turn more to the United States and go through the history of Native folks in the US. And my reason for doing so is that I do believe that we have to know and understand and deeply intuit that history and those stories in order to move forward and in order to really understand why Indigenous peoples carry the priorities that they do into legal advocacy, into shareholder advocacy, and into all that they do. So, and again, my perspective as a lawyer colors this history, colors the way that I speak about the history, but we know that, of course, Indigenous peoples have been subject to the racist and colonial policies globally since the onset of colonization. And the result is that today still there is economic invisibility that renders Native nations' efforts to move economic conditions challenging, not impossible, but challenging. In the United States, of course, at first, the French and the British treated with Native nations, and the United States itself signed multiple treaties. And in fact, it was the Department of Interior that was assigned a relationship with the with Native nations. In the early 1800s, that assignment was reassigned to the Department of War. As Native nations were seen as a threat, they were then treated as such, and those treaties were broken. We know that forced removal policies began in the early 1800s to remove Indigenous peoples and Native nations from their land. And this was intentional. It was an intentional policy, not just to grab the land, but to remove the Indian problem. And there's one eminent scholar that has called this a measured separatism, meaning it was on purpose. It was meant to make Indigenous peoples invisible, to put them over there. So Native peoples were put on far removed reservations and then away from their own communities and their own lands and territories. As we move forward in policy and law in the 1950s, many Native nations were terminated, or the relationship that they had with the federal government was ended. And there were policies in place to take people from the communities on the reservations and move them to cities. It was assimilationist. The idea was to assimilate people. If they were assimilated into majority culture, then tribes would go away. The Indian problem would go away. And of course, there is the longstanding policy of the United States to take children and put them into boarding schools. This policy started in the mid-1800s, and I will remind you that there were still boarding schools in operation until the 1970s. So the policy isn't that far gone in history. But the point was that the government tried to separate us from our children, first separate us from our land and resources and our lifeways, and then to separate us from our children. And that separation was meant to assimilate. The hope was that all of our ties to our people, to our culture, and to our place would disappear. I recount all of that history because the economic system in North America, the economic system in the US, has its roots in those same policies. So it's no surprise that that invisibility persists. In recent decades, since about the 1970s, tribal sovereignty and self-governance has increased and created new economic and employment opportunities for Native nations, resulting in economic growth and improved well-being overall. Self-determination, I believe, encompasses the rights to decision-making, to participation, to governance over the economic, social, cultural, and spiritual wealth and resources in Indigenous communities. It's the recognition that tribal leaders know their communities. They know the wealth that is in the people and the wealth that is the land and the wealth in the values. And so putting them to the forefront in order to understand and move those priorities forward. I'll just say that the challenges that all Native people face in the US are further exacerbated for many Native women. According to a 2020 study, American Indian and Alaska Native women in the US are paid 40% less than white non-Hispanic men working comparable hours. So this translates to almost $1 million loss over the course of a 40-year career. Conversely, we know that in 2018, American Indian women owned 1.4% of all female-owned businesses in the US and generated about $11 billion in revenue. And in fact, Native women-owned businesses grew by 201% since 1997. So all that to say there is growth. There is ascendancy in the Native economy and in the private sector economy on reservations and off reservations. And Native political power, legal power, and economic power is ascendant. But it is this moment that we can take to recognize the way that the structures were built, the way that they were built to make invisible, but the fact that Native people, that we are here, that our businesses are thriving, and that we have solutions that can help to solve for some of the biggest global challenges that all of us work on daily. So with that, I'll turn it back to you.
There, got it. Yeah, I'm off mute now. I was unable to unmute myself for a moment, so thank you, Kate. You've done a wonderful job of helping make visible for us that which has historically there's been a drive to make invisible. Let's turn to Keith Doxtator. Keith of the Oneida Nation is the director of Oneida Trust's Enrollments Department. He combines Oneida's cultural values and priorities with his financial planning background to align meaningful, impactful investments with the sustainability goals of the nation. Keith believes education and understanding of complex financial and enrollment topics can be accomplished visually and succinctly to empower decision makers and achieve broader community goals. Professionally, Keith helps lead Sustain Oneida, addressing their blood quantum issues. He also serves on the steering committee for the Investors and Indigenous Peoples Work Group, where Oneida aided in several investor engagements involving sustainability and Indigenous rights. And in fact, Keith's going to share with us now about the Native mascot engagement, where he and others have helped alongside ICCR members and alongside some SGI members be a catalyst for change. Keith, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Chris, and good morning, everyone. As Chris and I were chatting last week, he shared that the members of this group may be coming at it with some different levels of experience or different backgrounds on where they're at in their investor and engagement issues. And I volunteered just to take one issue, maybe all the way from the start to the finish, and just really lay down that track of where different parties and different interests can get involved, and how many different like-minded individuals can really build a momentum for a cause. And the Native mascot example, I think, is one that has experienced some more visible success recently, but really has a much, much longer history behind it, and really is a great example of all the work that many different people have done to help get us to this point. So go ahead, we'll flip forward. There we go, thank you. And real briefly, I think for those not aware of the Native mascot issue or some of the underlying problems, it really comes down to Native people not having control of their own identity, and it being hijacked by different parties and different interests over the years. I think the two most common examples I see is either the ultra aggressive, sports imagery, where it's a warrior like chant, or these images are taken with the very aggressive connotations behind them. Or alternatively, it's much more of the environmentalist, almost the pacifist, will have that tear shed whenever the earth is harmed. And I think both of those extremes do a disservice to Native cultures today, Native people today, and do not align the general public's expectation of who we are, the values we represent today, or many of the past traditions that Native peoples have subscribed to. This is particularly damaging for the youth. And there's a whole list of studies that I think outlines these consequences. The Native youth have shown the highest rates of bullying or being bullied. I think it's like triple the non-Native counts, highest school dropouts, highest high school drug use, lowest standardized test scores. And I don't mean to imply that that is solely attributable to Native mascots by any means, but I think that it's a broader misconception of how the general public sees a very small minority of our country right now, and almost how they then inflict that on children, or how the children are raised to see, well, this is the image of us in the public and what people think I should be, versus who and what they actually are. So I think it's a story of the broader Natives trying to reclaim their own determination of who we are and how we want those images portrayed. Go ahead, next slide, please. A lot of this is from a Nielsen study from just the last year or two, where there's a lot of growing support. I think we're well past the majority point now for broader America as a whole, saying we're not getting this type of education, but it should be part of our schools. I remember meeting with I have a younger niece. This was just before COVID when we were meeting regularly, but a Wisconsin high school graduate, and her making a comment of, Keith, all this stuff you're telling me is interesting, and I just wish our school had any sort of approach or taught us any of this. And that kind of baffled me because I thought Wisconsin was on the more progressive end. We had our Act 31 that went into effect about 30 years ago, mandating that all Wisconsin K through 12 education takes a week per school year to cover different Native American histories and cultures, and particularly the Wisconsin tribes. So I said, well, you have a Wisconsin diploma, you should have that educational piece. And it just led to a really interesting piece of where that miss came in. And I think it's that first bubble right there where it came in from, in the youth, it was the Thanksgiving story, which is maybe less than accurate, but not really helpful in the context of today's Native American tribes and where they stand. So I think it's just one broader piece to that self-determination piece. There we go, thank you. This leading into the mascot issue, it has a much longer standing history that I'm not going to go into before the investor piece of it was involved. I'll say the history, it goes back at least 50 years to when the more Native activists were challenging the name, whether it's in protests or whether it's a more court-driven appeal. But we'll just fast forward to the next one here. And I'll skip through this one as well. There's a lot of court cases from the last 10, 20 years that really drove down into this case. And I think that was laying a lot of the groundwork that the investors were able to jump onto and help leverage the social argument as well. The investor piece here really starts with my predecessor, my mentor, Susan White, pictured here. And her story starts maybe a decade or 15 years before this slide. I think she was very visionary from 25, 30 years ago standpoint, and starting to think about how Oneida's trust should and would incorporate our assets into our own values. It started with her engaging with our trust committee. Those are the 9 elected people that oversee our assets, and really asking them not only the investment questions and the risk questions that I think need to be asked, but right alongside those, starting to drill down on what are the values, what are the priorities, what else besides making a good risk-adjusted return do we want our money to accomplish? And it was a short list at the time. I think it was mostly, as an Indigenous voice, we wanted to raise those issues that impacted us and other Native voices across the country. There was also an environmental lens to that goal. But with that, the Native mascots became one of the very first topics that she identified. And it started small. It started in our own local community with our own local Little League teams to remove those generic, aggressive sounding names and images, and finding something more culturally aligned locally. And since then, the conversation has just expanded from regionally to statewide to eventually the national conversations that took place. As investors, we were able to hold the sponsors of the Washington team, FedEx is listed here as a slide, to make sure we were able to use the advocacy and engagement opportunities as given to a shareholder to make our voice known. And we really tried to elevate to the company, as the shareholder, we need to be concerned about the social risks and the potential reputational risks of aligning your brand with what we see as this racist mascot, and how it impacts the future business decisions from there. Yeah, and just a real quick finish up. Susan was instrumental in leading those conversations with FedEx and with other businesses. She spoke to their chair. She spoke at the annual meeting. And at the time, did not necessarily see that huge shift in attention that we were hoping for. But I think in hindsight, it was really those conversations that helped set up the dominoes that led to a lot of the future changes. So thank you. Just got ahead of the slide on me there. That brought us forth to the unfortunate events in May of 2020 and George Floyd's passing that led several companies, not just the FedEx and Nikes and Pepsis of the world, but many companies came out with their own statements on diversity, seeing these as a value, saying we need to elevate other people's stories. And I recall just an office or conversation or email chain going around citing some of those languages as very similar to the investor letters or Susan's words used from the last several years. And it seemed like a very opportunistic or engaging moment to rekindle some of those conversations. And I think that was just that one final domino push that was needed for a lot of the past work, both from Susan and IIPWG's investor engagement perspective, as well as other activists, outside of the investment sphere that we live in. It was that one push. I say little push, but it was, I think, 1,500 co-signers representing over 620 billion in assets under management that finally got their attention and sparked that initial reaction to the name change and saying something needed to be done. Go ahead, next slide, please. The response then was quick. In a matter of a couple weeks. The companies, I think, moved from hearing the message to asking the team for change, and then the team actually brought forth the change themselves. And like I said, it was, I don't think that it was just this one moment or just that one letter by any means that brought forth this change. It was the decades of activism prior. It was the several years of those shareholder risk type letters that I think planted the seed and really set the table for change to be made in a matter of what ended up being a week or two here. To wrap up my point then, or this engagement story, we were able to leverage that momentum to continue building on that momentum, building on that success. Since the Washington team changed the name, we're up to, I was trying to look it up, about 180, 190 more high schools across the country have discontinued the use of their native names. 21 states have passed or have now have formally put a new state resolution up for consideration, a bill that addresses native mascots. And I think it's amplifying the voices of both the investors' engagement efforts as well as the more social activists throughout the years. And final piece here, just tying it all back together. I as investors and as our underlying policy statement really drives down to, we're trying to make the good return, but we're also trying to align it to our values. And we really try to share that with the companies that we have the privilege of engaging with, of just aligning all of our interests. We try to make the business case to do the right thing from a human perspective, from a business perspective, from a risk perspective, and make sure everyone's aligned and represented as well as possible going forward.
Okay, thank you, Keith. And let's now turn to Steven. Steven Heim is a managing director for Boston Common Asset Management, an investment manager and a leader in global impact initiatives. Steven has over 30 years of experience in the responsible investment field, and Steven's efforts to protect the human rights of Indigenous peoples have helped catalyze positive policy changes at U.S. and international companies that included direct engagement with Indigenous peoples in the Ecuadorian Amazon. From 2007 to 2019, he chaired the advocacy subcommittee of the Investors and Indigenous Peoples Working Group, and he helped lead investor engagement to change the name of Washington's NFL team, which was accomplished as we just heard. With the IIPWG, he helped lead global investor engagements with major banks regarding the Dakota Access Pipeline and urging banks to revise the Equator Principles for project finance to respect Indigenous people's rights. Steven also serves on the board of directors of Cultural Survival and of the International Funders for Indigenous Peoples. So Steven will now share about the Dakota Access Pipeline engagement. Steven, thanks for being with us.
Great. Thank you, everyone. It's really an honor to be on this call with Keith and Kate, who I've worked with for several years now, and also working with Susan White. I actually heard about the Washington team name that they had made the switch. It was on the 4th of July weekend in 2020 with a text message from Carla Fredericks, who was the executive director of First Peoples Worldwide at the time. And it just brought a tear to my eye thinking about that because of the work of Susan White, and she had passed away before she could see this change, and also the work of Suzanne Harjo, who started in the 90s. So it's been an honor to work with them over the years and inspiration. And a little bit about my work with Boston Common. We're an investment manager, a global investment manager with a variety of clients. Some may be on the webinar today, but we are an investment manager. So I will, when we get to at about 4 billion assets under management right now, women-led, majority women, and employee-owned company. So also, I just want to note too, before I go in on Dakota Access Pipeline, where I'm currently is in Vermont, which is the traditional lands of the Benaki, the Abenaki people, who are here in Vermont for decades and centuries and however long they've been here. So I want to note that. So why don't we go to the very busy slide on Dakota Access Pipeline and beyond. So I want to tell the story here too, of just as we heard in the beginning, of the importance of stories and how we might start on one area, but then other things come from that we didn't expect or know were going to be happening, but felt that we had to move forward and do whatever we could. So that's kind of the underlying theme here with Dakota Access Pipeline. And in the upper right corner of the slide, you'll see the engagement context. As a public equity investors, both Boston Common and all the other investors that work on this, we are different from governments, NGOs, private equity investors, infrastructure investors, fixed income investors. And so we have different tools and things that we can do. And then some of those include letters and investor statements, annual meetings or AGMs, meeting with companies, shareholder proposals, thought leadership, webinars, conference calls, benchmark reports, and raising standards. All of these were done by investors that worked on the Dakota Access Pipeline engagement. So we tried to use everything we could. Just a very quick background on the pipeline itself, which you probably are aware of it, especially for those that are in the upper Midwest areas, because the route went from North Dakota and the Bakken oil shale all the way down in a straight line, I think to Ohio or wherever. I think someone know exactly where the final end of the pipeline, over 1,000 miles. And the plans actually started in 2014 by Energy Transfer Partners. And they did consultations with the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe and others on the path of the pipeline. But the problem is that maybe they did over 150 consultations, they claimed, either emails and whatever, but they didn't listen. Instead, they informed the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe and others of what their plans were going to be. And Kate will talk later about free prior informed consent, what that means, with regard to Indigenous peoples. So that was a fundamental problem for Energy Transfer Partners approach. And then rather than going around Bismarck, North Dakota, and then down to where the refineries were going to be, instead, Energy Transfer Partners put the pipeline route just below the reservation boundaries of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe under Lake Oahe and the Missouri River, which provided drinking water and fishing for the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, plus water for millions of people downstream. So it was actually, while it was technically just below the treaty boundary or the reservation boundary, the treaty boundary of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and the other Native nations there was much larger and was ignored as far as the rights of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. So with the Army Corps of Engineers approving the final permits for the pipeline to go under the Missouri River and Lake Oahe, Ford lead banks signed the loan agreement of $2.5 billion to Energy Transfer Partners and the Dakota Access Pipeline, with a total of 17 banks signing on. So that was the context in August of 2016, the first week of August. It was just 2 weeks later that on the Investors Indigenous Peoples Working Group conference call that we spoke with the father of the chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, Dave Archambault Sr. And he told us what was going on and asked for our help as investors. And they had contacted First Peoples Worldwide for help, and that's how they got in connection with them. So that was really the start of it. So in the lower left corner of the slide, you can see the initial call with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. And then as a group, the Investors Indigenous Peoples Working Group, we tried to figure out what to do, how we could help. So we organized in calls with Wall Street analysts who were following the different companies that were part of the Dakota Access Pipeline joint venture, private bank meetings with banks that helped finance it started. And then using the tool of share proposals, Boston Common helped recruit lead investors to file proposals with companies on free, prior, informed consent and their consultation process in joint ventures. Marathon Petroleum with the New York State Common Retirement Fund, Phillips 66 with the Presbyterian Church, Enbridge, who was the lead with Share and the Sisters of Charity of Halifax. And then shortly after, Phillips 66 made agreement to do a report with Presbyterian Church, and so they withdrew. But it was clear then that the banks were a key part of the issue and the problem, and how could we influence them? So that led to the drafting of the investor statement to banks financing Dakota Access Pipeline. And each step of the way, I want to note too, that we consulted with and got okay with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe for the investor actions. So that led to the focus on banks, but the Trump administration approved the pipeline going forward in February 2017. The pipeline itself became operational in June 2017, but we continued looking at the banks and their role in the Dakota Access Pipeline. And there were very strong votes in favor of the proposals at those companies I mentioned before. And Susan White made the presentation at the Marathon annual meeting. So we then started to look at the Equator Principles, which is a global environmental and social risk framework for project finance, which was considered at the time the gold standard for banks. And there were about 90 banks that had signed on to the Equator Principles. But unfortunately, for the banks and for everyone else, the Equator Principles didn't apply to north of the equator. They assumed that with the United States regulations and laws that they would be protected, and the banks signed on without doing their own due diligence with the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe or others that were fighting the project. So the investors put together a statement to the Equator Principles Association, asking them to revise it. There were also 6 banks in the spring who had divested from the Dakota Access Pipeline, and that there were 10 banks, including some of those that divested, saying we want the Equator Principles to revise what they're doing. So that was the next step of the engagement here. So we went from Dakota Access Pipeline to global banking standards and the Equator Principles. I want to note too that in June of 2019 was when the Equator Principles released their new draft standards, which they called nickname of EP4. And there were several US pension funds and others that contributed to the response. CalPERS, New York State, plus NEI Investments of Canada was also very integral in the analysis with assistance from First Peoples Worldwide and others. So we sent that off to the Equator Principles Association, and actually there's almost $3 trillion of investors who supported that recommendations to Equator Principles. But unfortunately, what they actually adopted was very weak and did not go far enough in protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples, including requiring free, prior, informed consent. And then the last actions I want to note too. So while the Equator Principles were revised, the Investors Indigenous Peoples Working Group continued to work on these issues of standards, including disclosure on climate risk and ESG factors to the SEC. And then also with the Line 3 pipeline in Minnesota, with the request and approval of the affected tribes and nations there, we put together an investor letter to the 10 banks that finance Enbridge. And that had almost about 2 trillion of investor support. And in the lower right corner of the slide, I want to note, could have been earlier in this timeline, but First Peoples Worldwide did an in-depth analysis of the social cost and material loss from the Dakota Access Pipeline by not having the due diligence by the companies, by the banks, and energy transfer partners going forward with the Dakota Access Pipeline, with an estimate of almost $8 billion. Let's see, it was at least $7.5 billion was one of the impacts, and then 4.4 billion cost of account closures for the banks. So that showed very clearly the impact on investors and banks and all the companies involved, besides all the communities and the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe and others. So I want to conclude at that point, and hopefully, Kate, you can give us some more background on free, prior, informed consent and why that's important for investors and banks and everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Steven. And please, Kate, let's go ahead with free, prior, informed consent.
All right, and I will speak quickly here because I know we want to leave some time for questions as well. And thank you, Steven, for threading that needle. So free, prior, and informed consent is, excuse me, written into the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a mechanism to uphold self-determination. Free, prior, and informed consent, can we go to the next slide? Really is meant to safeguard Indigenous rights. Excuse me. I have a frog in my throat this morning. To safeguard Indigenous rights and Indigenous peoples' rights. And the point of free, prior, and informed consent, as enumerated as a human rights standard, is to provide this opportunity for equity in decision-making and equity in participation. as to any development that impacts Indigenous peoples, lands, territories, and resources, to include education, intellectual property, cultural property, language. Free, prior, and informed consent is the way to make sure that Indigenous leaders have a say and are able to make decisions regarding their own lands, territories, resources, and communities. Can we go to the next slide? So when we at First Peoples Worldwide work in the private sector and with companies and investors, we know that a huge priority is social license to operate, particularly in the extractive sector. Well, social license to operate for Indigenous peoples is FPIC. Without FPIC, there is no social license to operate. And we know that one of the top 10 business risks for mining and metals companies, number 3 in this last year, and that's fallen. In 2018, it was number 1. The third biggest risk is social license to operate. So one of the questions that we ask, and that Steven and Keith ask when they have the opportunity to engage companies is, what is your FPIC policy? What are your FPIC procedures? And as Steven has said earlier too, so eloquently, it's not just about information giving. It's not just about sharing information or saying, this is what we're going to do. It's operationalizing the moment to understand what Indigenous leaders are saying. If Indigenous leaders say yes, what does that look like? If Indigenous leaders say no, what does that look like? And the company taking the time that it needs to take to understand and integrate those priorities. Next slide. So I just want to say here too quickly, we talk a lot about free, prior, and informed consent in the extractive sector. It is a part of our asks in any sector. And I want to thread here that Indigenous is everywhere. If you're looking at all of your portfolio, if you're looking through an ESG lens, there is an I everywhere, in the E, in the S, and in the G. So you will find a way to advocate, understand, and to push priorities for Indigenous peoples anywhere in your strategy as you move that strategy forward. I'd like to skip, please, to slide 34, Frank, if I can. There's a lot of different things going on. The slide on the Investors and Indigenous Peoples Working Group. Both Steven and Keith mentioned that this working group has been meeting for a very long time. Here it is. It's a monthly call. It's the third Thursday of every month at 11 a.m. Eastern. It's an open call. And the idea is that call is a clearinghouse for education, news, and joint action to bridge together investors and Indigenous peoples. We at First Peoples Worldwide are the Secretariat, which means that we help to tee up the agenda and to tee up the priorities for folks on that call. There's 4 big priorities that we work through on that call: ensuring FPIC, addressing the impacts of extractive industry, ending the use of racist images, stereotypes, and cultural appropriation, and building investor and corporate support for Indian countries. So I'll just say you are welcome to contact myself, and I will throw Steven and Keith in the mix as well if you have interest in joining that call. And yes, tomorrow we have a webinar at our regular call, and it will be on Indigenous peoples, biodiversity, and sustainable finance ahead of the Conference of the Parties in Montreal on the Convention on Biological Diversity, just linking together the need to understand where preservation of biodiversity, financial flows, and Indigenous, if we talk about all of those together, we can come up with some solutions that will work for all of us. So I'll throw that invitation out to you all and hand back the mic.
Thank you, Kate. That was, I apologize that 60 minutes moves so quickly. We would love to get some questions now from our members and from people here in the webinar. And so if you want to raise your hand, we can include you, or you can place it in the chat. Maybe just one question would be to say, or to ask, are there some examples of FPIC and how it has worked well, where those Indigenous leaders' voices were operationalized in in a positive fashion, as opposed to when you want to lift up somebody.
Okay, do you want to give an example?
There it is. I can unmute. So, and thank you for the question. We have yet to see the one big, this is where FPIC went right for everybody case. What I can say is there are a lot of different ways that it is going well. And my indicators for that is to say there are a lot of First Nations who are now doing equity deals with the private sector to have real stakes in projects and major projects, including fishing, seafood and waterway management, and in the extractive sector. That's FPIC gone well. They have equity, they have participation, they are putting their priorities out. And then there's other small examples of where companies have, done a decision tree about like, okay, when we go out and we look at FPIC, this is what it's going to look like, this is how it's going to be. So we're still waiting for that one big example, but I've seen lots of progress in many years. And it starts with, I think, a company having an Indigenous people's rights policy and having a free, prior, and informed consent policy, and asking that all of their contractors adhere to the same.
Thanks, Kate.
And the other part is the reverse of companies listing, no means no. That's been one of the key things over the years, where companies will continue to push and push and push until they get the yes, like the book Getting to Yes. But that's not what we want to see. And it also is but it gets, when the whole structure of free, prior, informed consent, each part, free, prior, informed consent, each one of those is important. And it does, companies have to be willing to take years and also to listen to no. And then also governments need to give the opportunity for these discussions and all, and not give a short timeline to companies either.
Yeah, thank you, Steven, especially for highlighting that about the consent. I remember in one dialogue with a company, a leader from the company used the word consultation rather than consent, which I think really undermined that very component of the place.
We see that quite frequently, actually, is this idea that consultation counts as consent. But in fact, consultation is a process and consent is a right. So as Steven said, it's not about getting to the yes or getting to the no. It's about what is the answer, and then putting the burden on the private sector to understand how they operationalize that, right? And understand how they react.
I want to just note one thing, and then I'll get to Frank's question in the chat about the Dakota Access Pipeline. Years ago, a Sami leader, Mateus Aren, told me, and he said I could use this quote later on, "You talk, you lose." And that's that very point where in the Sami people in Norway and Sweden and Finland were faced with large extractive projects, including wind power. And if you talk with them, then they will go say, okay, we did the consultation. That was same in the Amazon when I went there to Ecuador in 2005, where the Federation said, we are not going to talk with Burlington Resources. If we do, it'll be taken by the Ecuadorian government as consultation. And so then the company went around their backs to individual villages and et cetera, et cetera. That's another story. But then on Frank's question about Dakota Access Pipeline and mutual stakeholders, our investor perspective all along was, what does the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe want? Not what do all the people who want to stop oil development globally. So in that case, it was always, what does the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe? Same examples when I was in Ecuador and came back and met with the General Counsel of Burlington Resources. He asked me, do you want us to exit from Ecuador? And my answer to him was, I want you to listen to the wishes of the indigenous peoples there. So that is really what I think is key in all of this, is a self-determination part of it. That to me is the key.
Thanks. For those who've gone to the ICCR conferences, Stephen has a particular gift on the Friday mornings, oftentimes of gathering lots of different companies and different investors in some Chatham House Rules conversations. And I always admire the way you thread those conversations together, Stephen. Is there a particular, maybe to ask, to say, is there a particular piece in the listening that you do to be able to elicit that conversation that you think would be a good practice for all investors?
I guess it would be of putting all your cards on the table. What are your concerns? Lay them all out. Have the biggest critics and challenge the companies. And also I try to give them the questions ahead of time. See, it's, even if it's a scripted answer, still it's getting the discussion going, the dialogue going with everyone. And also just persistence, which is more the ICCR way.
Thanks, Stephen. Certainly, we know that from the timelines we saw in these engagements that there's been a lot of, there's an obligation for persistence. Keith, you have some roles where you get to work with youth, and what are some signs of hope for you, based on the experience of looking at the mascot engagement, but also just the broader signs of hope for you about ways that voices of Indigenous people are being better heard by shareholders, by companies?
I have got to talk to a lot of the youth in our community. It's a captive audience when we also hold their minor trust funds, but I do think we're hearing from them more and more on ways to become engaged, ways to become educated, ways to, especially for those that are not local, ways to become culturally involved. And I think they're asking for things that I'm confident did not exist in my youth. And I think they're just going to be so much further ahead of the game. They're thinking and asking questions that took our generation, much through college and beyond to get to. So if they're already looking for the info and posing the questions, and I think taking it one step further is going to either local leadership or their city leadership, or potentially bigger scales beyond that leadership. They're laying the groundwork for us.
Thank you. Maybe I'll open it to you if you've got a final word you want to share. We're at the top of the hour already, but
You're welcome to join the IIPWG. We started actually as an independent group in June, July of 2016. We were U.S. SIF Social Investment Forum provided us staff support up until that time. So we're very grateful for U.S. SIF, but it was only a month or so before Dakota Access Pipeline and our engagement started. So, but we had this platform for investors and everyone to participate at that point. You didn't have to be a U.S. SIF member. So I think at this point, that's the key thing I would say is just become active.
Thank you. I think that's right. And to find ways that we can help hold multinational corporations responsible for their behavior when they've not been sufficiently beholden to the local population and their concerns. I guess my final word to you all would be thank you. Kate, Keith, Stephen, we are blessed to be able to have had you with us this morning. And to our members to say we've got a charge to be catalysts for change. Shareholders are making their voices heard at the highest levels of corporate power across every social and environmental issue. And we've heard how that I is a part of that of the E and S and G. This movement works because members, people like you and me, are coming together ready to act. And real change comes through societal shifts, the kinds of things that Keith was pointing to in his work with young people, his conversations with them. And SGI members working along others in ICCR and IPWG have a long history of taking on big initiatives and achieving big things for people and planet. So thank you so much. We'll get the recording out to everybody shortly. We'll pass the slide deck along, and as well links for information about IIPWG. Have a great day, and once more, thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thanks all.